Welcome back to the Global Ledger. I'm Justin. If you follow markets even casually, you've heard this sentence 1,000 times. The Fed raised rates, the Fed cut rates. Markets are pricing in the next Fed move. I think we've heard all this before. But almost always, what people are referring to is the federal funds rate. But here's the reality. The Fed funds rate isn't what most people think it is anymore. And in many ways, it hasn't been for a long time. Today's episode is about why. Because if you still picture banks scrambling overnight to borrow reserves, if you still think the Fed controls rates by making money scarce, then you're using an outdated map to understand a very modern system. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what the Fed funds market used to represent, what it represents today, and why the real center of short-term rate control has quietly shifted. Let's get into it. Historically, the federal funds rate played a very specific role. Banks were required to hold reserves to settle payments. Those reserves were scarce. Some banks ended the day short, others ended the day long. So banks lent reserves to each other overnight, unsecured, at the federal funds rate. The central bank influenced this rate by adding reserves when rates rose, draining reserves when rates fell. Okay, so in that world, reserves were scarce. The Fed funds market mattered, and the price of reserves cleared through actual trading activity. This is the version of the system most textbooks, I think, still describe. And that's what I've reviewed anyways. Why that world ended, okay, is an important question. The global financial crisis really changed a lot. In response, the central bank didn't just cut rates. It flooded the system with reserves. Large-scale asset purchases dramatically increased these reserve balances, and scarcity would then disappear. By the 2010s, banks were no longer competing for reserves. They were holding far more than what they needed. Okay, and once reserves stop being scarce, something important happens. The market that used to set the price stops doing real price discovery. Okay, so once reserves stop being scarce, the market that used to set the price stops doing real price discovery. Okay, the Fed funds market didn't vanish, but it became thin, very technical, and largely administrative. Today, most Fed funds trades involve institutions that don't even have access to interest on reserves. IORB, like we talked about in the very last episode 51, I believe. So, volume is low, and the rate itself is observed, not discovered. Fed funds still exist, but it no longer drives the system. Okay? So let's look at the ample reserve system, which we now operate in, okay? We now operate in what policymakers would describe as an ample reserves regime. That phrase really matters, okay? And in this system, the central bank does not finely manage reserve quantities. It does not rely on scarcity. It relies on administrative interest rates. Instead of nudging markets indirectly, it posts rates directly. Okay, so the most important of these is interest on reserve balances. Okay, that is the floor for the banks that have reserve accounts at the Federal Reserve. This is the rate banks earn simply by just holding reserves with the Federal Reserve. Okay, and once you understand that, the entire rate structure starts to make sense. Okay, and so think of the modern system as a corridor. Okay, at the very top of the corridor, banks can earn a risk-free rate by holding reserves, IORB. At the bottom, non-bank institutions can earn a secured rate through overnight facilities. Okay, that's the ONRRP, which we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to. Market rates trade between those two boundaries, trade between the IORB and the ONRRP. Okay, banks will not lend below what they can earn risk-free. Non-banks will not lend below their own floor. Okay, so where does Fed funds fit? It floats inside the corridor, reacting to policy, not driving it. Okay, that's why obsessing over Fed funds headlines often misses what's actually happening underneath. In today's system, short-term rates are anchored by administered prices. Liquidity conditions are shaped by balance sheets, and funding markets matter more than labels. This is why repo markets matter more than Fed funds. Okay, this is why collateral matters more than reserve scarcity, and this is why market structure matters more than press conferences. The central bank isn't whispering to markets anymore; it's posting terms. So why does this matter for markets and valuation? This shift is not an academic one, okay? If you care about asset prices, funding costs, risk-free rates, or financial conditions in general, then you need to know where those inputs actually come from. They don't originate in Fed funds. They originate in administered rates, secured funding markets, and the willingness of balance sheets to intermediate risk. Misunderstanding this leads to bad macro narratives, misplaced fears, and really a flawed valuation assumptions. Okay, we need to watch the right mechanisms. The federal funds rate still exists. Okay, it still gets quoted and it still makes headlines, but it is no longer the lever most people think it is. If you want to understand monetary policy, especially modern monetary policy, focus on administrative rates, focus on funding markets, and focus on balance sheets, because once you stop watching the wrong dial, the system starts to become much easier to read. I want to thank you for listening to episode 52 of the Global Ledger. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about QE and QT. This is a really important and very misunderstood topic. So I welcome you to join me. Once again, I'm Justin, and thanks for being here.